Award winners and your families, University of Louisville trustees and leaders, faculty and staff colleagues, U of L and Louisville Seminary students, alumni, and treasured friends, students of human nature everywhere. I'm Charlie Leonard, Executive Director of the University of Louisville Grawemeyer Awards. It's my deeply felt honor to welcome you to this 2021 virtual version of the Grawemeyer Awards celebration. It's my pleasure next to introduce the University of Louisville's president, Dr. Neely Bendapudi, to welcome you to these ceremonies. She'll be followed by the Reverend Dr. Alton B Pollard III, president of the Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. The seminary, on whose board Mr. Charles Grawemeyer was a life member, jointly administers the Grawemeyer Award in Religion.
Thank you, Charlie, and congratulations to our Grawemeyer Award recipients. I am so thrilled to welcome you all, virtually of course, to the University of Louisville. When we announced our 6 distinguished winners back in December 2019, none of us had any idea that a global pandemic would prevent us from celebrating together as we always have. But then, the pandemic forced all of us to change. Well, almost everything had to change. Here at U of L, we were still determined to keep our traditions thriving and moving forward. I congratulate Dr. Charles Leonard of U of L, Dr. Alton Pollard of Louisville Seminary, and everyone else who's been involved with the Grawemeyer Awards for making tonight's program a reality. Each of you stepped up and applied innovative thinking and creativity so that this program could go on. We applaud you. It's that same kind of innovation and creativity that are the hallmarks of these awards. For more than 30 years, the University of Louisville has honored the vision of Charles Grawemeyer, a UFL alumnus who believed that ideas have the power to make the world a better place. He understood that the flame of an idea must first be sparked by inspiration and then fanned into a blaze of creativity, innovation, and action. A blaze large enough and bright enough to cast its transformative glow on all of humanity. Tonight, we are recognizing 6 outstanding individuals and the ideas they ignited through their passion and dedication. Mr. Grawemeyer always credited the University of Louisville with giving him the knowledge to succeed, both personally and professionally. His generosity in establishing the Grawemeyer Awards is a testament to his appreciation. In many ways, the Grawemeyer Awards represent the highest ideals of our university, encouraging creative thought and intellectual risk, developing engaged citizens and scholars, and improving the quality of life for local and global communities. And our 2021 recipients represent what we, as educators, strive to help our students become: people with the knowledge and resources to be successful, and with the courage to make their own unique contributions to the world. Tonight, the flames of education, innovation, and transformation burn brightly. Thanks to Mr. Grawemeyer and to each of you, I want to extend an extra special thank you to the Grawemeyer family for all of their support and in continuing this great legacy. We all are the better for it. Thank you, and go Cards!
Good evening. My name is Alton B Pollard III, and I serve as president of Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. I am pleased, on behalf of the Louisville Seminary community, to join Dr. Neely Bendapudi and our friends and colleagues at the University of Louisville in welcoming our Grawemeyer Award winners this evening, and indeed in welcoming all of you to our live stream celebration. The partnership that Louisville Seminary and the University of Louisville share in awarding the Grawemeyer Award in Religion, celebrates the vision of Charlie Grawemeyer, and reflects his love and dedication to these two great schools, on the boards of which he served with distinction. It also reflects Charlie Grawemeyer's imagination and his conviction that ideas can shape the world for the better. This evening, we come together to celebrate Charlie's vision and once again to bear witness to the power of ideas. I am grateful that Charlie Grawemeyer turned to the University of Louisville and Louisville Seminary to help make his great vision a reality. Over the years, both of our institutions have brought leaders and scholars from around the world to our community to share their insights and to inspire us with their ideas. Charlie's gift continues to bear testimony to the power of ideas. I invite those who desire to join me in prayer. God, we pray that you will liberate us from whatever prevents us from loving as you love, that we may do justice and walk humbly with you. And teach us, we pray, to change that which we cannot accept and to entrust that which we cannot know to you, whom we cannot name. Amen.
Thank you, Neely and Alton, for your comments. Charles Grawemeyer, an alumnus of the University of Louisville's Speed School of Engineering, was a lifelong learner and a student of the human condition. He studied and thought long and hard about how to structure his generously endowed awards program so that it would be known worldwide to recognize the power that individual ideas can have to improve the human condition. He looked at the most famous international awards and identified important areas of thought they did not include. Then he added an important twist. All the award-winning ideas we will honor tonight, after a long vetting process, were finally chosen by lay panels of community members, not by career experts or specialists. Mr. Grawemeyer believed that for an idea to truly travel around the world, it must be able to be understood by the wider community. He did not want his awards program, in his words, to be the private treasure of academics. We typically recognize our awards panels at our banquet, and we expect to honor the jurors of the 2021 awards at future in-person events. I'd like to add a personal and institutional thank you to those individuals who contributed their time and attention to the selection of this year's Grawemeyer winners. Finally, I'd like to echo Neely's appreciation of Mr. Grawemeyer's family, whom I've come to know over my years as a custodian of the Grawemeyer Awards. Nancy, Marion, Martha, Terry, and your families, thank you for your abiding interest and ongoing support of the awards program your father and grandfather created. The first Grawemeyer Award for music composition was given in 1985. Here to introduce this year's winner is the Music Awards Faculty Director, Dr. Mark Satterwhite, the longest tenured of the faculty award directors, and a member of the composition faculty in the University of Louisville's School of Music. Mark?
Thank you, Charlie. Good evening. I'm pleased to welcome you to this much belated but still very happy occasion. The winner of the 2021 Grawemeyer Award for Music Composition is Lei Liang for his orchestral work, A Thousand Mountains, A Million Streams. As it is trivially easy these days to find out pretty much anything you want to know about anybody, I won't go into the extensive detail about Dr. Liang's biography. Originally from China, he studied in the U.S. at the New England Conservatory and Harvard University. Since then, he has been enjoying a skyrocketing career, earning the top awards in the field, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Brome Prize, besides the Grawemeyer Award. as well as important commissions from soloists and ensembles at the very highest levels. He comes to us from San Diego, where he is the Chancellor's Distinguished Professor at the University of San Diego School of Music. There is music which is just about itself, sometimes called absolute music, usually with titles like symphony or quartet. And there is also music which consciously and deliberately engages some aspect or other of the outside world, often called program music. If you look at the list of Grawemeyer Award winners, you will find more of the latter than the former, although absolute music is certainly ably represented. Subjects explored in Grawemeyer winning works include nature, spirituality, cultural interactions and clash, romantic love, current events, politics, and history. 2 winning works are Holocaust-themed, for example, and one was written in response to the AIDS crisis. There are operas which by nature tell a story. Dr. Liang's winning work, A Thousand Mountains, A Million Streams, is a cry from the heart inspired by the threats of global climate change, but offering hope and redemption at the end. Let me end with just a brief quote from the composer. When creating the work, I wanted to convey the importance of preserving our landscapes, both physically and spiritually, to sustain a place where we and our children can belong. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Lei Liang. I'm the winner of the Grawemeyer Music Composition Award. And I want to use this opportunity to first thank the Grawemeyer Award Program at the University of Louisville for this incredible honor. There are a lot of people I want to thank, starting with Mr. Robert Amory, who commissioned this work, A Thousand Mountains, A Million Streams. Without his friendship and generosity, I wouldn't have written this piece. I would also like to thank the late Mr. Junying Cao, who is a great connoisseur, scholar, and a collector of Chinese traditional paintings. It was through his generosity that we were able to analyze the set of Chinese landscape paintings by Huang Minghong that inspired my composition. I would also like to thank my colleagues here at UC San Diego, especially my colleagues at Qualcomm Institute, including Professor Folko Kuester of Engineering, and my good friend, the sound software designer, Zachary Seldes, and a large team of wonderful friends who I believe our disruptive research really inspired me to write this set of composition. And lastly, I want to thank the musicians of Boston Modern Orchestra Project, led by Maestro Gil Rose. It was their impeccable performance of my music that brought my music to life, and I want to thank every single musician in this orchestra for their dedication. My journey is an immigrant's journey. In fact, it has a very special connection to Kentucky. I would just start by telling you that I was born and raised in China until I was 17 years old. And the way I think about it is that in the last 200 years or so, we Chinese people have built another great wall. It's a wall that separated ourselves from our own heritage and our own ancestors. The reason I mention that is in the last 200 years or so, there's a lot of conflict and self-inflicted destruction, culminating in the years 1966 to 1976, the Great Cultural Revolution. As a result, when I was born in the last years of the Cultural Revolution, China was a very, very different place spiritually and culturally from how my grandfather's was raised. So to give you one example, I studied the Chinese characters that's called the simplified Chinese characters. And here I have an example of the written word for the dragon. And on the top, you will see the simplified version of this word, and on the bottom, the traditional word. You can see the difference is very, very striking. Of course, not all the Chinese words in these two categories are that different. Some of them are identical, some of them are more similar, but there are also examples like this. And I wanted to tell you that my story started when I had the great pleasure of meeting a very special lady. That was when I was 15 years old in Beijing, 1988. I gave my first recital of my compositions for the piano, and that was at the Central Conservatory in Beijing. This lady, Mrs. June Rose Garrett from Bowling Green, Kentucky, she came to my recital as a family friend, and she stayed in touch with me. And it was because of her that in 1990, that out of her kindness and generosity, that she helped me to come to America. And I was then just a high school student. And the thing I want to mention about my journey up to that point is that it was in America where I discovered China. This might sound a little strange, but I remember one of the happiest days was when I arrived in Austin, Texas, where I was a high school student, and I walked into the university library, and I was so shocked to see the open shelf collection of books on China. I got to contextualize this a little bit for you, because when I was growing up in China, there was no open shelf library. In fact, when I was a student, our library, the school where I studied, had very few books for the student to read. And it was always a hassle to borrow a book. You know, you have to fill out a card and you bring it to a person who always gave me a grumpy look. and it was just a difficult experience to have access to knowledge. And when I walked into the university library at UT Austin, I was stunned by the transparency of knowledge. On one side of the shelf, there might be books printed about China in simplified Chinese. And then on the other side, books printed in traditional Chinese, books on China written in English. It was then I realized that history, our heritage, is something that we have to reconstruct word by word. And it was also then that I decided I must master the traditional Chinese that I was not taught when I was growing up in China, because that was an important step for me to break that wall. I was born on this side of the wall, having almost no access, no understanding of what was written in the books that was printed during the time of my grandfather and before. But I have to break that wall for myself in order to know where I came from. So one of the things that studying Chinese traditional characters that gave me access to is this enormous amount of information about Chinese paintings. I love hand copying some of these treatises on Chinese paintings. And it was in this process when I was in college studying in Boston that I encountered the writing by Huang Binghong, this great painter. What is so astonishing about him, there are many, many aspects of him that fascinated me. But one particular period in his creativity that was just astounding was the year 1952, when Huang Binghong was blind. He created some of the most magical Chinese paintings we have seen in history. And it was also a time when I think about it is Huang Binghong, in his blindness, he was able to resurrect a world, reconstruct a world that is perhaps more magical than reality. This is something that is very important to me, because part of what we do as artists, I think it's about preserving and creating a world in response to what we live through. Perhaps in the process of preserving and recreation, we can perhaps create something even more beautiful. Huang Binghong, his paintings are very unusual. In this period there, you see a small album leaf, but it has so many, many layers inside of them. It's almost multidimensional. When I studied this set of paintings, I have a fantasy that I wanted to create a sonic brush for me to paint, as if I can paint something with sounds. And to do that, I was blessed to have an extraordinary opportunity right here at Qualcomm Institute of UC San Diego to assemble a team, people including engineers, robotic engineers, data scientists, visualization scientists, to software developers and sound designers. So we use our imagination and try to develop the tools that will allow me to paint. For example, we extracted a written character on the painting by Huang Minghong. We could then project the trajectory of the written character into the space where my music is played. Therefore, you can actually hear, as an audience member sitting in the auditorium, how the sound is moving around your body as if it was projected by a brush. I have a large section of my music that is based on analysis of sounds of stones. In Chinese painting, landscape is often referred to as shan shui painting, or mountain and water painting. And as a musical reference to mountains, I use sounds of the rocks, analyze the inner spectrum of these rocks, and then use that as the harmonic foundation for my music. Another example is in one of the experiments we did hyperspectral scanning and high definition scanning, and we were able to analyze the materials of these paintings. And our sonic team converted the spectral information into sonic filters. Therefore, you can actually hear what the materials of this painting sound like. It was a magical process, and we discovered many very intimate, creative experience with the painting that was only possible because we brought a team of such multidisciplinary, multimodal practitioners together to reimagine what our heritage is. And we learned a great deal in this process. And it's part of this experience that I learned through this research that I want to capture with this composition for the orchestra. This part of the work really laid the foundation for a lot of other projects. Right now, I'm working closely with same team led by Professor Volko Quester here at the School of Engineering, and also scientists from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. I'm learning a lot more about our environment. In the past, in music, we talk about the three big Bs, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, and because of my interaction with these scientists, I'm learning a great deal about things I didn't know before, such as the sound in the Arctic, the whales, and I'm learning about coral reefs and the earth and atmospheric rivers. All of these things have become very, very important sources of inspiration for me. So for me, the new three big Bs are beluga whales, the bowhead whales, and bearded seals. I'm becoming a student again, and what I would like to do is continue what we have done with the set of Chinese paintings, that the awareness that we as artists and scientists working together, we're always preserving and understanding and advancing and also creating a world that is better, one character at a time, one sound at a time, one image at a time, one pixel at a time, and one digibyte at a time, because that's what we are doing today. And I think it, for me personally, helped me to find a new place for music among all these disciplines, why what we're doing is important.
The next Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order was first presented in 1988. Introducing this year's award winner is its Faculty Award Director, Professor and University Scholar in Political Science, Dr. Charles Ziegler. Chuck?
Thank you, Charlie. Very pleased to introduce to you our 2021 Grawemeyer winner for Ideas Improving World Order, Dr. Ken Konka from American University. On our website, we note that the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order is given to those who have taken on issues of world importance and presented viewpoints that could lead to a more just and peaceful world. Each idea supports one noble cause, and that is to inspire us all to work together for the common good. I doubt that we could find an issue that impacts the common good more than our natural environment and climate change. They're recognized as key issues for all of humankind. No state can do it alone. It requires collective action. And Dr. Conca's work, An Unfinished Foundation, the United Nations and Global Environmental Governance, addresses that issue. As he points out in his award-winning book, the United Nations is not really set up to work with environmental issues. It has done quite a bit. It has accomplished a lot. But he argues for a reconceptualization of how we approach the environment through the United Nations. He suggests that it's important to look at a clean environment as a fundamental human right and to recognize that a clean environment is central to peace and security. He suggests certain reforms within the United Nations and the UN Security Council that go beyond the current approaches. With the politicization of environmental issues in our day and age, this book is more timely than ever. Dr. Conca is professor in the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C. His research and teaching focus on global environmental governance, environmental peace building in war-torn societies, environmental politics, and policy in the United Nations system, in addition to water governance and policy analysis. Dr. Conca is the editor of the widely used teaching anthology, Green Planet Blues, and in addition to the Grawemeyer Award, he has also won the International Studies Association's Harold and Margaret Sprout Award for Best Book on International Environmental Affairs, the Chadwick Alger Prize for Best Book in the Field of International Organization, and the Al Mumin Environmental Peacebuilding Award. Finally, Dr. Conca is a member of the United Nations Environment Program's Expert Advisory Group on Conflict and Peacebuilding. I give you Dr. Ken Conca.
Good evening. I'd like to thank the Grawemeyer Awards for recognizing my work in the category of ideas that improve world order. When I look at some of the past recipients of this award, it's quite humbling and gratifying to think that my work belongs alongside theirs. There's some people on that list that have profoundly influenced my own thinking about global governance and international affairs. And so thank you very much for this recognition. I'd also like to thank Mr. Grawemeyer for having the vision of an award that emphasizes the power of ideas. That's something I believe in very much. And finally, I'd like to thank the people in and around the United Nations who've helped me understand that organization better over the years, how it works, when it fails to work, and how it engages the great environmental challenges of our era. And make no mistake, those challenges are great. It's estimated that 2/3 of the world's fisheries are fished to the limit or overfished. The amount of forests that we've lost, while the global rate of deforestation is decreasing, the amount of forests that we lose each year is roughly equal to the size of the state of Kentucky. The World Health Organization estimates that 3 million people each year die prematurely because of air pollution. And there are something like 2 billion people on the planet who lack a safe and reliable supply of drinking water. And I haven't even mentioned climate change. As I've worked on these issues over the years, I've had many engagements with the United Nations. I've provided expert advice to the International Law Commission as it seeks to develop a treaty that would try to protect the environment in the context of armed conflict. I've worked for many years alongside the UN Environment Program, its post-disaster and post-conflict programs that try to put environmental governance and smart natural resources management at the heart of strategies for recovery for countries that are emerging from conflict or recovering from disaster. I have had the privilege of briefing ambassadors at UN headquarters on climate change as a threat to international peace. And I've worked for many years with many civil society organizations that are trying to push and prod and cajole the UN to be smarter and more aggressive in how it engages our environmental challenges. As I've done that work, I've also watched as the UN, unfortunately, has grown increasingly marginalized in the great debates about global environmental governance. The UN is an organization that is increasingly unable to negotiate new treaties on pressing environmental matters, increasingly unable to modernize and upgrade the existing treaties that we have, unable to create more than a weak, voluntary, and woefully inadequate framework for tackling the great challenge of climate change, and struggling to implement the Sustainable Development Goals to which the organization committed in 2015. As I've watched this process of decline in effectiveness and incoherence, despite all the very good and important work that the UN continues to do, I've also noticed a puzzling pattern. An organization that was intended to stand on 4 legs, when it comes to the environment, typically only stands on 2. If you read the UN Charter, it's quite clear that the founders gave the organization a 4-part mandate and intended it to tackle the 4 great challenges of the post-World War II period: peace and security, human rights, development, and international law. And yet, when it comes to the environment, we see a great deal of activity around the UN on international environmental law, and we see a great deal of activity on sustainable development. We see very little on the way that the environment connects with the UN's mandate on peace and security, and we also see very little on the question of environmental human rights. If the UN could be said to have a grand strategy on how to deal with global environmental governance, essentially it consists of better law between nations and smarter development within them. I've become convinced over time that this off-balance posture, it reminds me a little bit of a horse that has 4 legs, but is trying to balance itself on the 2 legs on one side of its body, while the other legs dangle unused in the air, only occasionally touching the ground in order to give the creature its balance. This is obviously a horse that's not moving forward at a steady gait, much less galloping forward the way we need it to, given the substantial challenges that we face. I've become convinced that this off-balance posture is in fact a key piece to the story of the UN's growing marginalization and irrelevance. One reason for this is simply globalization. The UN approach of better law between nations and better governance and development within them is a sort of a 19th century quaint vision of how international relations works. It bears very little resemblance to the global political economy we have, in which production chains snake in and out and around and across borders continuously, in which global financial markets can move vast amounts of capital around the planet very quickly, and in which the world is so interconnected that everything from ideas to refugees to new diseases can move across borders in a heartbeat. In that world, there are simply too many hiding spaces beyond the reach of either international law or national frameworks for sustainable development. And so what we need, instead of simply a top-down attempt to craft rules through treaties, what we need is a bottom-up empowerment of people and communities. Communities on the receiving end of those environmental insults need the rights-based power to say, no, not here in this place. And until we strengthen the rights of communities that have seen their environmental qualities sacrificed for the sake of global consumers, there will always be another place where toxics can be dumped. There will always be a place where polluting industries can be offshored and where landscapes can be sacrificed to oil and gas or mining or logging. So we need that third leg of the United Nations, the human rights tools that it's able to wield, as a critical tool in the toolkit for environmental governance and for rights-based community empowerment. The second reason that this two-legged off-balance approach does not work is the conflict trap. If we look at the list of countries that most badly are in need of sustainable development, that struggle to provide their citizens with clean air and clean water, that are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change or intensifying natural disasters. It's the same list of countries that are the most racked by war, by political violence, and by instability. It's estimated that 1/3 to 1/2 of all the development assistance that is invested is blown away by a subsequent war or a subsequent disaster. We've learned that peace and stability are an essential prerequisite for environmental progress. And so we need the fourth leg of the UN's tools, its tools in peace building, mediation, preventive diplomacy, and sanctions to become critical tools of environmental governance as well. So what to do? Well, in my book, I talk about several reforms, large and small, that would start moving the UN toward this more effective and coherent and leadership posture that we badly need. I'll simply mention a few of the larger suggestions here. It's time for the United Nations to declare a human right to environmental quality. The Human Rights Council within the UN has been debating this issue for a few decades now. It's time to stop the debate and put the full moral force of UN human rights behind the idea that people have a right to breathable air and clean water, and that they also have a right to political engagement in the environmental decisions that affect them. Second, we need UN human rights to be mobilized in a more practical way to defend environmental defenders. It's estimated that the number of environmental activists who have been murdered or disappeared in the past decade is roughly the same as the number of journalists who died in the line of duty. We know that covering the news in a war zone or doing investigative journalism against powerful interests can be dangerous business. Well, it turns out that environmental advocacy is also very dangerous business, and we need the UN's human rights spotlight to shine brightly on that problem. Third, we need to talk not just about the rights of people and communities, but also the responsibilities of governments. It's time for UN member states to commit to a responsibility to protect people who've been rendered vulnerable by environmental change. The UN does heroic work aiding people who have been affected by war and by famine. We need to recognize that in some instances, those people are also fleeing climate change or intensified natural disasters, or maybe the slow violence of the damage to local ecosystems on which they base their livelihoods. Just as UN member states have recognized their collective responsibility to prevent war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity, they need to make a similar commitment to the people and communities that have been rendered vulnerable by climate change and other drivers of harm. And we need this commitment to have two dimensions. It has to have a proactive, preventive stance, but it also has to recognize our ethical obligation to provide assistance when those preventive efforts fail us. Finally, we need to find the right role for the UN Security Council. The Council has been trying to find its voice on the question of climate change as a threat to peace and security for 15 years now, and it has yet to fully do so. No one is suggesting that the Council should be the center of the UN's efforts on human rights. As a body, it lacks the legitimacy, it lacks the representativeness, and frankly, it lacks the tools and the skill to play that role at the heart of the UN's climate efforts. But it's also useless if it remains just a talking shop, which is the way it's primarily used today. We need the Council to focus its conflict prevention and mediation efforts much more centrally on natural resource and environment-related disputes, to help countries that share a river basin or a stretch of coastline or an offshore fishery to manage their conflicts in a peaceful manner before they get out of hand. And there are more conflicts ahead. And we also need the UN to be smarter about how climate change affects its own operations in peacekeeping and in engagements with fragile states that are already on its agenda, and to give it the tools for information and for analysis that it needs to play that role in a climate-smart fashion. Some of these ideas are hard and controversial reforms, and they're going to require a long-term struggle. In other cases, we are starting to see some signs of action and of gaining traction. Governments campaigning for a seat on the Security Council will now routinely place their vision for the Council's role on climate change at the center of their campaigns. And in the process, we're starting to get some very creative proposals about how to educate the Council and make it collect and share and act on information in a much more climate-smart manner. The Secretary General has begun to refer to climate justice as a human rights issue, and to shine that spotlight on the problem of defending environmental defenders. That's a voice that we need to encourage and we need to amplify. Perhaps most encouragingly, I see a growing recognition across the UN system that the environment need not simply be a source of conflict and a source of rights violations. It can also be a tool for peace building. I first published a book 20 years ago called Environmental Peacemaking that suggested that the environment could be an important part of the peace builder's toolkit, helping to create trust, using people's environmental relationships and interdependencies as a way to start to establish a habit of cooperation, to soften conflict identities, and to build a stronger basis in trust and reciprocity. Those ideas were met with skepticism, frankly. But today, we see a process where the idea that the environment can be a peace-building tool is increasingly diffusing across the entire UN system and its efforts. And the UN is even at the point of starting to develop training programs on environmental peace building for its staff operatives. Again, that's a tool that's valuable, and that's a trend that we want to encourage and amplify. The challenges are great, and these developments are just a starting point, to be sure. We should make no mistake about that. But they do show me that change is possible, and they give me hope that a re-energized United Nations can play the leading role that we very much need from it. And if this award can help call attention to those ideas and help augment some of these beginning processes of change, then we'll have accomplished something very important together. And for that, I'm grateful. Thank you.
The Grawemeyer Award in Religion, jointly administered with Louisville Seminary, was first given in 1990. Presenting the 2021 award is its faculty director, the A.B. Rhodes Associate Professor of the Old Testament at Louisville Seminary, the Reverend Dr. Tyler Mayfield. Tyler?
Good evening. I am delighted to be here tonight to celebrate the 2021 Grawemeyer winner in religion. It is a joy to introduce Dr. Stephen Patterson, the George H. Atkinson Professor of Religious and Ethical Studies at Willamette University. He has won the 2021 Grawemeyer Award in Religion for ideas in his 2018 book, The Forgotten Creed: Christianity's Original Struggle Against Bigotry, Slavery, and Sexism. Dr. Patterson completed graduate studies at Harvard University, Claremont Graduate University, and Heidelberg, and taught for more than 20 years at Eden Theological Seminary in St. Louis before moving to Willamette University in 2010. He was a leading figure in the Jesus Seminar for more than a decade and has appeared on numerous documentaries, talk shows, and videos. In 9 books and more than 75 articles, essays, and reviews, Dr. Patterson has explored the origins of Christianity, especially those texts and traditions outside of the biblical canon, and those hidden histories and traditions that have been lost along the way, especially the lost Gospels, Q, and the Gospel of Thomas. Patterson's big idea in The Forgotten Creed centers on a statement from the origins of Christianity before Paul and the writers of the Gospels. It is not a traditional theological statement about God or Christ, but one about human identity. It is perhaps early Christianity's first creed, long forgotten, but nestled still within Paul's letter to the Galatians, and it claims that we are all God's children, a remarkable assertion of human solidarity. This creed imagined a world in opposition to the Roman Empire's caste system, a world in which baptism brought about solidarity. Patterson's work is truly worthy of the Grawemeyer Award in Religion, and we are delighted to hear from our winner tonight about his work. Congratulations, Dr. Patterson, on receiving the 2021 Grawemeyer Award in Religion.
Good evening. I want to start by thanking everybody tonight associated with the Grawemeyer Awards, the University of Louisville and the Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, all the good folks there who did the research behind this year's awards, who put this program together for us tonight, and of course the Grawemeyer family, whose generosity makes the awards possible. And the more I learn about Charles Grawemeyer and his, the way he was and his interests, his life, the more I appreciate how much he devoted himself to the life of the mind. Very grateful for this award and humbled. Thank you very much. The award this year is given to some work that I've been doing about an ancient creed, an ancient Christian creed, tucked into the pages of one of the Apostle Paul's letters, namely to the Galatians. It's probably a baptismal creed. That's what most of us think it was. And Paul includes it to make an argument. He alters it, but with a little bit of analysis and dusting off, you can recover more or less what the original creed was. And this is how I reconstruct it. It went basically like this. You are all children of God. There is no Jew or Greek. There is no slave or free. There is no male and female, for you are all one. It's unusual as Christian creeds go. I think you'll agree. It says nothing about God or about Jesus Christ or about the way to salvation. It's about you. It's about the baptized, I guess, telling them who they are. They are children of God, sons of God, literally. The creed probably would have sounded remarkably cosmopolitan even to ancient people. There were high-minded folks in the ancient world who thought this way, who thought that the world would be a better place if we could all live more egalitarian lives under the benevolent, watchful eyes of the gods. But most people lived lives of remarkable inequality, and those who were on the winning end of that inequality reveled in it. There is an ancient cliche that captures the mindset, the zeitgeist, if you will, that was formulated in different ways in different places. But it basically went like this. I thank the gods every day that I was born a Roman, not a barbarian, that I was born free, not a slave, that I was born a man and not a woman. There are the basic elements of the ancient caste system. Roman barbarian, that's ethnicity or race, if you will. I was born free, not a slave. There's the basic class distinction in antiquity. That I was born a man and not a woman. That's gender, race, class, and gender. These are the three things by which ancient people built their own elaborate caste systems. Our creed, in a sense, stands that ancient cliche on its head by saying there is no Jew or Greek. That's ethnicity, right? There is no slave or free. There is class. There is no male and female. And that's gender. These things, they say, just don't exist as natural states. That this is just the way the world is. Our creed says these things don't exist. They are products of a busy human imagination that seeks always to construct systems of hierarchy and caste, race, class, and gender. In the end, the creed says, for you are all one. I think that's also important. It doesn't say, by the way, you are all the same, as if to will away all difference and diversity. That's not the point. You are all one does not signal sameness. It signals solidarity. That's the point. Solidarity across race and gender, class. That's the point. I suppose you will have guessed by now that the context for this work is America's caste system, which is constructed more or less along the same lines, race, class, and gender. race especially, as Isabel Wilkerson has underlined in her recent work, caste. America has a basic white-black caste system that has existed since the 17th century, when it was invented to justify white Europeans enslaving black Africans. But religion was in there too. In fact, America's first caste system was constructed more on religion. That was what Europeans brought with them to the Americas. The idea that you could not enslave a baptized Christian. You could only enslave an unbaptized heathen, so called. And that was the standard for a long time, until African slaves and indigenous Americans who were being enslaved began to seek out baptism as a route to freedom. Then the slavers looked around for another more permanent, less malleable border, and they came upon color. They invented white for Europeans and black for Africans. I'm telling you things you all know, of course. But this is how religion becomes involved in American caste. America's dominant caste was originally Christian. And baptism signaled that caste status. So America's ruling caste would forever be both white and Christian. And that's important. I suppose the context for this work is also the present state of American Christianity. As we all, Americans all, go through now another season of coming to grips with our caste system, American Christians are asking themselves, what role have we played? Has Christianity played in all of this? Rituals are important. The ritual of baptism is an important ritual, has defined Christianity for generations. What does it mean? What did it mean for people to say you can enslave unbaptized but not baptized people? You know, baptism meant repentance, it meant salvation, yes, but it was also an initiation ritual. In fact, that was its primary function. It was the initiation rite. So it signaled explicitly us from them. It signaled insider, outsider. It signaled the saved from the damned. It, more than any other ritual, created that sense of us and them. That's why white Christians balked at the idea of even baptizing Africans, because they could not imagine them being us. And so black Christians formed their own churches and did their own baptizing, but white Christians never fully accepted that. And that is why, of course, today American Christianity is still largely segregated, and America's churches are among the most segregated spaces in American society. So rituals shape us. They pass along generation after generation that social knowledge that tells us who we are and who we are not. We have to take them seriously. And that's why I'm looking at this material. I think that the meaning of baptism has been terribly important in our history. And when I think on this creed, this original baptismal creed, I think some interesting thoughts. What if baptism had not always been the entry point, the thing that says we are we and they are them? What if it instead had said, there is no we and them, there is no us and them, there is no community of the saved and a community of the damned? What if instead it said, no, we are all children of God? What if it staked out that territory instead? That we are all one in spite of the differences that people try to construct in the human family. I think that would have been a very different thing. So my work is mostly historical. I hope that if you chance to read it, you'll enjoy it. And this history that I write about will spark your imagination as it has mine. So thank you again to the Grawemeyer family and everybody involved in the awards. I do appreciate the honor. Thank you.
The University of Louisville presented the first Grawemeyer Award in Education in 1989. Here to introduce the 2021 winners is Dr. Marion Evan Hambrick of our College of Education and Human Development. Marion.
Thank you, Dr. Leonard. I'm proud to introduce the 2021 Grawemeyer Award in Education winners, Dr. Jal Mehta and Dr. Sarah Fine, for their work in search of a deeper learning, the quest to remake the American high school. Dr. Mehta is a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. His research explores the use of knowledge to address social and political problems, including those found in American education and teaching. Dr. Fine currently directs the High Tech High Graduate School of Education Teaching Apprentice Program. She also teaches courses in education studies at the University of California, San Diego. Their award-winning work sought to find deeper learning in American high schools, where students can gain knowledge about academic content, develop an ability to think critically and problem solve, and work and communicate effectively with others. Dr. Mehta and Dr. Fine spent 6 years in 30 high schools across the United States, ranging from project-based schools to no excuses, to international baccalaureate, to comprehensive schools. There are 750 hours in classrooms and extracurricular activities, combined with more than 300 interviews with students and their parents, teachers and administrators, and other educational stakeholders. Dr. Mehta and Dr. Fine said, "This is not a book we set out to write. We were seeking inspiration, we found complexity. Rather than documenting wide-scale, deeper learning within schools, they instead unearthed pockets of this learning taking place within individual classrooms and extracurricular activities. They found focusing on enacting full-scale, deeper learning in every classroom and every school across the nation could lead to significant frustration given long-standing systemic challenges in education. Instead, schools, students, teachers, and leaders can benefit from creating an academic environment where learning opportunities arise from a myriad of places in and outside of classrooms. Their book offers a new look at high schools and education in America. Their analysis provides a comprehensive view of these learning environments and offers hope for those seeking to create more in-depth learning in academic settings. One juror for this award said the authors present ideas for providing deeper learning opportunities for both current and future students to develop their 21st century skills that they will need to be productive citizens, ideas of significant social significance. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our 2021 Grawemeyer Award in Education winners, Dr. Jal Mehta and Dr. Sarah Fine.
I'm Jal Mehta, professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and the proud co-recipient of the Grawemeyer Award in Education.
And I'm Sarah Fine, Jal's co-author and currently the director of the San Diego Teacher Residency at the High Tech High Graduate School of Education. The project that resulted in our book, In Search of Deeper Learning, The Quest to Remake the American High School, was originally going to be a small set of case studies. In the end, however, it was more of an odyssey, a journey that spanned 6 years, 30 different schools, hundreds of classrooms, and scores of interviews with teachers, students, parents, and administrators. Describing and making sense of everything we saw took us 400 pages, and that's far too much for a short talk. Instead, we're going to take a cue from some of the best teachers we know by going deep instead of broad. So over the next 10 minutes or so, we'd like to dig into one key idea that emerged from our work. The idea that schooling is not the same thing as learning. And in many American high schools, it's often quite the opposite. Let me say that one more time. Schooling is not the same thing as learning, and in many American high schools, it's often quite the opposite. Consider what comes to mind when you think about schooling. Hallways, lockers, bells, textbooks and worksheets and 5-paragraph essays. Kids hustling between classes and teachers standing at the front of the room, lecturing or giving directions. Students taking notes or passing notes, or on getting back graded work, whispering, "What'd you get?" Now consider what comes to mind when you think about learning, in particular learning that is powerful and sticky in the long term. This kind of learning often begins with curiosity and playfulness, which over time evolves into passion and persistence. Motivation and commitment provide the discipline to persist. And when you're in the learning zone, like really in it, the minutes and hours slide by without notice. Over time, as you learn more and become more skillful, you begin to see and think about the work differently. You also begin to think about yourself differently. Your self-concept transforms from someone who keeps a journal to a writer, from someone who takes piano lessons to a musician, from someone who likes math to a budding mathematician. Unfortunately, in our travels, even in schools deemed to be particularly innovative or successful, we didn't encounter a lot of classes where this kind of learning was happening. In general, students didn't see much purpose or meaning in what they were being asked to do. Some were defiant. Others spent their energy playing the game of school. Very few, however, talked about their classes as places where they felt deeply engaged or pushed to grow as thinkers or as people. This was true for most students, but it was especially pronounced for culturally and linguistically diverse students, who often were the most under-challenged and under-supported, and who described feeling alienated by an institution that systematically devalued them. National studies confirm that most high school students are bored daily. Only 32% of 11th graders report being engaged by school. And as one Spanish teacher told us, ruefully, "I've got a lot of kids who would rather be in, a dungeon." So what accounts for this reality? If you take a quick look at the history of American secondary education, it becomes pretty clear that schools were designed to do many things, but learning was not at the top of the list. The country's public schools at various points have been about giving parents a way to remain economically productive during their child-rearing years, about assimilating immigrants and people of color into the values of a white and male-dominated capitalist society, and about sorting, tracking, and batch processing students in ways which mirrored the power dynamics of the status quo. Only for a very small percentage of students, mainly those born into extreme privilege, have schools and classrooms been places where substantive learning has been the dominant goal.
So when we talk about the mismatch between schooling and learning, we can come across as pretty gloomy. But we're actually pretty optimistic, in part because alongside the disengagement that Sarah described, we found many sources of hope. One of these sources was simply the incredible young people that we encountered in our work. On many of our visits, we would get a chance to have lunch with a group of students and talk with them about their school and their lives. They were consistently incisive observers, amateur anthropologists who offered penetrating insights about the nature of the institutions that were housing them. Far from the shallow and self-absorbed stereotype that American society often holds of its teenagers, the students we met expressed a passionate desire to contribute, lead, and learn. They just needed their schools to do a better job at providing the conditions for them to do so. One place that showed what students could do was the world of learning that existed at what we ended up calling the periphery of schools. So these are things like electives and extracurriculars, green engineering, debate, theater, school newspaper, dance, athletic teams, and the arts. As different as these spaces were from each other, they shared some essential qualities. Instead of feeling like training grounds or holding pens, they felt like design studios or research labs. Coaching replaced professing as the dominant mode of teaching. Apprenticeship was the primary mode of learning. Authority rested not with teachers or students, but with what the work demanded. And success could only be achieved by genuine collaboration. Consider Rose, a seemingly shy junior we met at a well-regarded suburban comprehensive high school. At 2 o'clock, Rose was sitting in her English class, mindlessly filling out a worksheet which asked her to match Shakespeare quotes to the character who said them. She slouched in her seat and wrote only at the insistent prompting of the teacher. But by 3:30 the same afternoon, she was the stage manager of the school's production of A Servant of Two Masters. Affect had transformed. She was poised, energetic, and purposeful as she consulted different actors about their upcoming scenes and prepared to run the rehearsal. And so as we explored these extracurricular spaces in more depth, we identified some specific features that made them powerful places for learning. It all started with purpose. People involved knew what they were doing, why they were doing it, and where things were going. As one student told us, why do I have a schedule of my rehearsals but not of my classes? And by that she meant, my rehearsal schedule shows me that I should be here on Wednesday at 5 o'clock, but not on Thursday at 4 o'clock. And that's because on Wednesday at 5 o'clock, they're rehearsing a scene that I'm in, and Thursday at 4, they're not. Whereas when I go into math class, for example, they just hand me what I'm doing that day. I have no sense of where we're going or why. Second point is leadership and agency. As you could see in the example of Rose, students are really transformed when they're given an opportunity to take responsibility for the work that they're doing. And then associated with that is apprenticeship learning. Rose wouldn't have been able to be the stage manager of a show when she entered as a freshman, but by the time she was a junior, she'd been in 6 productions. She'd seen a full run of this thing 6 times. And by that point, she was ready to take this kind of leadership and responsibility. And as anyone who knows who's had kids knows, kids are always more willing to listen to other kids than they are to adults. They had the time and space to do the work. The Spanish teacher that Sarah referred to, who described his students as feeling like being in a dungeon when he taught Spanish, when he was teaching theater, he had fewer kids, he had more time, he was working on something they were all passionate about, and it really transformed the experience. And then finally, community. When we asked students what made it so special, they said more than anything, it was just having a group of people with whom they identified, who they would see every day after school. Some of the students in this school said they didn't even know the names of all of the students in their classes, because why would you? The transaction is essentially between the teacher and the student, whereas in a theater production, you're all dependent on one another, and thus you need to know each other's names. Finally, to borrow a concept from our colleague David Perkins, students in these type of spaces are playing the whole game at the junior level. The whole game at the junior level. So think about something like Little League. You don't spend 1 year throwing and 1 year catching and 1 year batting and then say, oh yeah, when you get to graduate school, you can play a whole game of baseball. You're doing it all from the start. And if you have little kids, you know that 7 or 8 year olds playing a whole game of baseball isn't pretty, but at least the kids get a sense of what the whole thing is and why one might want to do it. Which doesn't mean you don't practice the parts. Of course, you have to take your grounders or practice your scales, but you do so in the context of understanding the whole. And then once we've thought about these extracurriculars, these powerful learning environments as whole games, when we looked back at school, we thought, oh, there's a lot of parts, but not so many wholes.
So as you can start to see, the spaces within high schools where learning is the deepest are often the ones that are least governed by the rules and rhythms of schooling. Another way that we like to think about this is that 2 different logics reign in the same buildings. Before the final bell, schools treat students as passive recipients of knowledge and as people whose interests and identities don't really matter. After the final bell, though, in things like newspaper, debate, theater, athletics, and more, schools treat students as people who can learn by doing, people who can teach as well as learn, and people whose passions and ideas are worth taking seriously.
So how can we make what happens before the bell more like what happens after it? The technical fixes are pretty obvious, and there were some schools that had done some of these things. Longer blocks, fewer worksheets, giving students more choice and agency over their learning, standards that emphasize depth over breadth, letting go of pacing guidelines that move through things so quickly, smaller classroom communities and reduced teacher load, an assessment system that is less about grades and test scores and more about producing quality work, culturally relevant curriculum that is connected to students' interests and identities.
More important than any one of these fixes, though, is what we would have to fundamentally change about our notion of what it means to do school. We need to think about the places where we send our children during the day, less as places where kids, quote, master the curriculum and earn grades and rack up seat time, and more as workshops or studios or any of the many other less institutional places where people learn in the real world. We have to accept that the most powerful learning doesn't happen in lockstep. It's often jagged and lumpy with 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And we have to embrace that there are many things worth learning, many different ways to engage as a learner, and a bottomless well of brilliance that young people have to offer if we can find ways to value their contributions.
So we want to close with one more metaphor: school as public square or a microcosm of democracy. As is probably painfully obvious to many of you, the world is not in great shape. COVID-19 is just the tip of the iceberg. The qualities that are needed to address it and other major challenges like climate change, rampant inequality, global poverty, are things like bold leadership, belief in scientific expertise, cooperation across nations and boundaries, empathy, perspective taking, trust, particularly in people who seem not like oneself, concern for the common good. And those qualities are in short supply, or at least they're not in the kind of supply that we need. And to face these challenges, we need schools, our one common public institution, to be places that do much more than socialize young people to become expert test takers, to become people who do school. We need citizens who can listen, reason, persuade, engage, and lead. And we have young people who can't wait to do so. We just need to transfer schools into places of learning. In this case, learning that will help us remake the world. Thank you.
The newest Grawemeyer Award is in psychology, first awarded in 2001. Here to introduce the 2021 winner is this award's faculty director, Dr. Keith Lyle of the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences in U of L's College of Arts and Sciences. Keith?
Thank you, Charlie. Good evening. The recipient of the 2021 Grawemeyer Award in Psychology is Dr. Robert Ploman. Dr. Ploman is MRC Research Professor in Behavioral Genetics at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience, King's College London. The title of Dr. Ploman's award-winning idea is The Nature of Nurture. The idea is that people's genes find expression not only in physical characteristics and behavior, but in environments, the things that nurture us. This happens because genetic influences on behavior ultimately affect one's experiences and surroundings. For example, individuals with a genetic propensity to be highly curious are likely to surround themselves with many books. Dr. Ploman's realization that environmental measures like number of books in a household are related to genetics was transformative. At the time he put forth his idea, the environment was seen as something that happened to us passively. Dr. Ploman showed that we and our genes are much more active agents. His idea revolutionized how we think about one of the most important questions we ever pose: what makes us who we are? Dr. Ploman and others have applied this idea in many settings, including school achievement, helping us understand the genetic and environmental influences on two of the most important variables in any person's life: how many years an individual persists in school and how well the individual performs in school. Dr. Ploman's idea is bold, creative, and impactful, exactly the type of idea that Mr. Charles Grawemeyer hoped to honor. I congratulate Dr. Ploman on winning this award. We'll now hear from Dr. Ploman himself.
I'm delighted to receive this Grawemeyer Award, although I am very sorry not to be able to accept it in person. I'm pleased by the award, not just for myself, but because it's a tangible sign of the acceptance of genetics in psychology. When I was a graduate student in psychology at the University of Texas at Austin in the early 70s, environmentalism, the view that we are what we learn, so dominated psychology that genetics was not even mentioned. Now, 50 years later, I think it's safe to say that most psychologists accept that genetics plays an important role in making us who we are as individuals, our personality, our mental health and illness, and our cognitive abilities and disabilities. The issue of the relative influence of genes and environment has been called the nature-nurture controversy. The word nature is much broader than my use of the word genetic. When we talk about our nature, we often mean human nature, how our human species evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. We all have the same DNA steps for over 99% of the 3 billion steps in the spiral staircase of DNA, the famous double helix. This is what makes us human, why we walk on 2 feet, why we have eyes in the front of our head, and why we talk. However, when I use the word genetics, I mean something much narrower, the 1% of DNA that differs between us and that makes us who we are as individuals. So how do we know that inherited DNA differences are important? There are 2 classic designs, the twin design and the adoption design. The twin design compares the resemblance of identical twins who are identical genetically to the resemblance of fraternal twins who, like any brother and sister, are 50% similar genetically. If a trait shows genetic influence, you have to predict that identical twins will be more similar for the trait than fraternal twins. Hundreds of twin studies have shown that nearly all psychological traits show substantial genetic influence. Twin studies can also be used to estimate that about half of the differences between us across all psychological traits are caused by inherited DNA differences. These results from twin studies are backed up by a completely different design, the adoption design. The adoption design compares the resemblance of genetically related individuals adopted apart who share nature but not nurture, and the resemblance of genetically unrelated individuals adopted together who share nurture but not nature. For example, we can study birth parents and their adopted away children to study the effects of nature, and we can study adoptive parents and their adopted children to study the effects of nurture. We know that inherited DNA differences are important for psychological traits from a century of such twin and adoption studies. A critical caveat is that these are genetic influences, not hardwired deterministic factors that cannot be changed. Genetic influences nudge us to use our environment to foster our genetic propensities. This is at the heart of my Grawemeyer Award. An exciting new development is the ability to use DNA differences directly to assess their influence on psychological traits. Such DNA research is mostly what I do these days, but the Grawemeyer Award is for my earlier research at the interface between nature and nurture. I'm especially pleased by the Grawemeyer Award because it's not just about the importance of genetics. The award recognizes my research using genetics to understand how the environment affects our psychological development. As the award states, genes make us who we are by influencing how we interact with the world around us, driving the way we select, modify, and even create our environment. This research began in the 1980s with the amazing finding that measures of the environment widely used in psychology, such as parenting, social support, and life events, show genetic influence. For example, the first research that I did on this topic involved life events. Measures of life events assess the routine ups and downs of life, such as breakdown in relationships, financial difficulties, problems at work, illnesses and injuries, and being robbed or assaulted. These life events have been used in thousands of psychological studies as measures of the environment. Despite all of this research on life events, no one had ever even asked if individual differences in these experiences are influenced by genetic differences between people. If life events are just a matter of bad luck, they should not show genetic influence. In a study conducted in the 1980s that combined twin and adoption designs, we showed that inherited DNA differences account for about 25% of the differences between people on a standard measure of life events. I went on to find similar results for most environmental measures used in psychology, such as parenting measures, peer groups, social support, and even how much time children spend watching television. How is it possible to find genetic influence on environmental measures when environments have no DNA? Well, genetic influence slips in because the environment is not just out there randomly independent of us and our behavior. The point is we select, modify, and even create our environments in line with our genetic propensities. Consider measures of life events, for example. People can experience the same event very differently. Measures of life events rely on perceptions of whether an event occurred and perceptions of how you respond to the event. Genetic influence can affect both of these perceptions. People differ in what they're willing to call a serious illness or injury, a financial difficulty, or a relationship breakdown. Personality is especially involved in how much they feel these events affected them. Optimists might see these experiences through rose-colored glasses, while pessimists see them in shades of gray. But it's not just perceptions. The events themselves can show genetic influence. For example, divorce shows genetic influence. Divorce doesn't just happen by chance, as I can attest based on personal experience. We make or break our relationships. We're not just passive bystanders at the whim of events out there. Now, as always, genetic influence means just that, influence, not hardwired genetic determinism. I hope it's clear by now that this research is not saying that there is a divorce gene that makes some people hardwired to get divorced. Genetic influences are probabilistic propensities, not predetermined programming. By 1991, there were 18 similar studies that reported results for genetic analyses of various environmental measures, which I summarized in one of my most highly cited papers. I was amazed at how consistently these studies showed genetic influence. On average, inherited DNA differences accounted for 25% of the variance of environmental measures. Genetic influence is not just limited to self-report questionnaires like life events. Genetic influence is just as strong for observational studies of parent-child interaction in which, for example, researchers rated specific behaviors of parents and children. Finding that genetic influence is just as strong for objective observational measures as for subjective self-report measures suggests that genetic influence on experience is not just in the eye of the beholder. In the 30 years since these first studies were reported, more than 150 papers have shown genetic influence on environmental measures. The average genetic influence is still about 25%. What's new is that these studies have greatly extended the list of environmental measures that show genetic influence. For example, evidence for genetic influence has been found for home environments such as chaotic family environments, classroom environments such as supportive teachers, peer characteristics such as bullying, neighborhood safety, work environments, being exposed to drugs, and marriage quality. The point of this research is that experience is not just something that happens to us. With all our genetically rich differences in personality, we differ in our propensity to experience and interpret life events, to watch television, and to get divorced. Once you start thinking about how much DNA matters, it's difficult to point to any psychological experiences devoid of possible genetic influence. For example, accidents are not always accidental. Sometimes accidents do just happen, but genetic differences in personality can increase the likelihood of accidents happening. The only events free from genetic influence are those over which we have little control, such as the death or illness of relatives and friends. Nonetheless, our reactions to such events, our psychological experience of the events, can be influenced by our genetic makeup. The importance of environmental measures lies in their psychological impact. If genes affect environmental measures as well as psychological measures, this raises the possibility that genes also contribute to the association between them. For example, stressful life events correlate with depression. Rather than assuming that such correlations are caused environmentally, I hope you will ask, what about genetics? Research has shown that for most of these correlations between environmental measures and psychological traits, genetics accounts for about half of the correlation. What this means is that the correlation between life events and depression emerges because people who are depressed for genetic reasons are more likely to experience life events that they view as stressful. Another common example involves correlations between parenting and children's development. As one of dozens of examples, parental negativity correlates with their children's antisocial behavior. But this doesn't mean that the parents' negativity causes their children's antisocial behavior. Instead, this correlation is substantially caused by parents responding negatively to their children's genetically driven antisocial propensities. This research suggests a new way of thinking about experience. In the past, psychologists assumed that the environment is what happens to us passively. Taking genetics into account suggests an active model of experience. Psychological environments are not out there imposed on us passively. They are in here, experienced by us as we actively perceive, interpret, select, modify, and even create environments correlated with our genetic propensities. This is a general model for thinking about how we use the environment to get what our DNA blueprint whispers that it wants. This is the nature of nurture. Thank you again for the Grawemeyer Award.
I want to thank all of you for being with us at this event, which is so important to the life of our university. While the COVID pandemic has put in-person gatherings like ours on hold for now, the intellectual force of human ideas to change the world and elevate the human condition marches on. The University of Louisville Grawemeyer Awards will continue to recognize and to celebrate the power of ideas. Here's to seeing you all in Louisville for the 2022 Grawemeyer Awards. Good night, and thank you so much.